Here I am, Andrew Gibbons, and in conversation today, again with Rebecca Norton. Today, we're exploring ethics, which is a broad subject and it can take us in all sorts of places, but we do want to tie it down to some specifics. So, Rebecca, briefly tell us who you are and kick us off on this interesting and sometimes sensitive issue.
Thank you, Andrew. Yeah, I'm Rebecca Norton from Sense of Direction, and today we're going to have a chat about ethics. So I love your title, The Only Way is Ethics. It is very good, thank you. And it's one of those really important topics that perhaps is more assumed rather than actively agreed to some extent. I'm hoping that all coaches would have that conversation at the beginning of a relationship with a client about ethics. I certainly send all my clients a copy of the ethics to which I adhere.
Which are those, Rebecca? Which yours?
Mine are from the Coaching Academy. So I trained with the Coaching Academy. So I have a list of ethics that I adhere to as part of one of their students.
Okay.
And yeah, there's some key things in there: what I will do, what I won't do,
sure,
my responsibilities, and how I'm expected to treat my clients, really,
in order to, at a contractual time, to set the context for the expectation of you, I guess.
Yeah, it's definitely around sort of setting that expectation from both parties as well, because if a client enters into a relationship with a coach, then I expect them to do certain things as well as they can expect me to follow certain guidelines. So it is a two-way thing.
Good. Yeah, I'm glad you raised that before I did, because yeah, we don't take this all on ourselves. It is reasonable to expect ethical behaviour from those with whom we work.
Definitely, yeah. So the ethics that I send out is more about the things that I adhere to, but within my contract with my clients, I certainly list the things that I expect from them. If coaching is going to work, then they have to take the responsibility for taking action, keeping an open mind, willing to stretch themselves as well. Coaching is a very powerful process, but it's not always easy, and I always make that I always make my clients aware of that fact as well.
Do you get any reaction to that? Some even negative reaction? It might be a surprise to some people to find they're having that conversation.
I haven't as yet. Whether I do or not, I would hope that people who get to that point where they actually take on a coach will be in the mindset of growth and wanting to change and wanting to do something different. So I generally, and again, you know, maybe it will bite me on the bum at some point, but I generally assume that people who come for coaching with me do have a willingness to engage in the process.
It's interesting you say that, and it's making me think, and I thought about this before, at what point in the process, your word, and it's my word too, at what point in the process do we introduce ethics? Is it in advance of, in effect, signing people up? Do we surprise them with it after we've got them? I quite like to explore, at least in general terms, ethical responsibilities, expectations and issues in advance of actually someone starting to work with you, because they might be adverse to that.
Yeah, I think that's key. I think you have to have that conversation before. They've got to agree to those guidelines, ethics, before they sign up and start working with you, I think. And I know this is something that we touched on before, that it gets interesting when you are working with somebody who perhaps is an employee of an organisation. So this is where the ethics is probably even more important in some respects. So I generally work with clients one-to-one with no third parties, but I have done the occasional thing where we've worked with an organisation. So for example, a school employed coaches to go in and work with the staff. Now the staff voluntarily agree to coaching. But again, I don't necessarily know how explicitly they were given that information before we turned up to do the coaching with them. And I think that's where it gets interesting, isn't it? So I know you said you've had experience of working with organisations.
I certainly have, Rebecca, because I've been doing corporate, if you like, internal to an organisation coaching for longer than I have working with individuals, particularly individuals who are standalone, if you like, who don't come from within an organization. I think back to a lot of the organizational coaching I did, I'm going back 15, 20 years. I don't think I could have got either the organization themselves, certainly not the individuals I worked with, to sign up to anything like we're talking about.
No. And I suppose things have changed to some extent, so for the better in general.
Definitely.
But I think there's greater expectation on us as coaches, and I think that's where we have to be very clear about, not making any guarantees, because ultimately it's down to the client to take the action to get the results. We can't make people get results as coaches. And I think that's really important for both the client to know, whether that's the individual client or whether that's the paying client, i.e. the employer as well.
Sure.
Sometimes I think they expect you to go in and fix things.
Yeah.
And it's not quite as easy as doing that, is it? And I'm sure you'll be aware.
No, I think that's absolutely right. It rings true with my own experience, Rebecca, because particularly when I've been employed by a client to do what turns out to be remedial work, not for thick people, but not for people with the need to address an issue. That's a terrible thing to say, and I'll try and edit that out. But remedial in terms of performance. And so sitting in front of those people and trying to have a meaningful rapport is difficult, because they think, you're here to find me out, you're here to recommend I'm kicked out of this place. It's very hard to have a conversation about ethics in front of someone who's worried about keeping their job.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so important to build that rapport, and that can be difficult if they don't trust you.
Yes.
So I think you have to be as clear as possible. And one of the things that I let people know when I'm working with them is, if I don't think I'm the right person for you,
Sure.
then I will be very clear about that as well. So in terms of if they come and they present with things that I think probably counselling would be more appropriate,
yes,
then I'm obliged to let them know that in a very sensitive way, obviously. But I think transparency is something that's key in ethics with regards to coaching.
I think it is. And of course, transparency is perceived by all parties. When we believe we're being transparent, that might not be how it's seen by others, particularly those that we work with. And I think we've got to be careful not to be seduced by our own spectacular abilities, and ask ourselves the question more often maybe than we do, am I reading this the same way as the people I'm working with are reading this?
Yeah. And I guess that's one of our skills as coaches, isn't it? That we learn and develop as we go along. And part of that is summarising or sort of paraphrasing or feeding back, reflecting back to your client.
Yeah.
I understand you mean this, or am I correct in thinking this is what you're saying? And like you said, sometimes when people verbalise things, they're actually thinking something different.
Absolutely.
And it lands differently. So it's really important to check in with them. What is it that you actually mean? Because, if I'm talking about success and you're talking about success, we could have two completely different things that we're aiming for.
I think so. So let's get into some issues here. I know when I feel I've needed to consciously, deliberately, sometimes in the moment, sometimes after the moment, reflecting in action, reflecting after action. I know that I can recall times when I've thought, what's the ethical thing to do here? Now, just throwing this at you, there's a bit of a sort of spiky one, but when have you ever felt that you're in an ethical dilemma or in a situation which requires an ethical judgment?
Very good question. I think there's potentially been the odd time where I felt that the client has presented something, a situation or a problem that perhaps I've experienced personally. Right. And I'm then very aware. I think as the more I practice, the more I become more experienced in just being aware that, that's triggered that emotion in me, or I'm judging them. I'm very aware not to sort of be judgmental. And we all make snap judgments a lot of the time, but I think it's very important to be conscious of recognizing if something's coming up in me as a coach that thinks, I'm responding to this in a way that I didn't necessarily expect to respond, or that subject that they're talking about is very close to the bone for my own experience in this. So I need to be aware now not to be putting my views and my opinions onto them.
Oh,
And I
that's a
think
good. Sorry, I cut in there, but that is good, isn't it? Because I think we can all relate to that. And if we can't relate to that, I suspect we aren't having those thoughts often enough because it happens so regularly. Yeah, just because I feel this, because I'd have done this, because I feel this is the right thing to do. The judging people thing, just not judging people, that's a hard thing not to do.
it is very difficult, and it takes practice, but it takes a great deal of self-awareness. I think sometimes we're not even aware that we're making those judgments. You know, sometimes, like you said before, you mentioned the reflection thing after it,
Sure.
before, and I think sometimes we may just reflect on it and think, oh, actually, I wonder if I was maybe judging that situation, or maybe I could have dealt with that in a different manner. You know, so I think there is a skill in practicing, reflecting on that, and just being more aware of it in future, really.
Well, that also assumes we like the people we're working with. I am prepared to say that I've taken people on in the belief I'd like them more than I turned out to. And that can get in the mix sometimes. Whether that's an ethical issue, I guess it is, because we ought to treat people all consistently, fairly, reasonably. It's easier to work well and to work naturally, perhaps with people that we have an affinity with, that we share values with, that we seem to like. And maybe there's an ethical dimension to the fact that not everyone is like ourselves.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think it raises a couple of things. I mean, I work for myself, and I choose who I work with generally. Like I said, mainly I work with individuals, so I get to choose whether to work with them or not.
Yep.
And so I would always have a conversation with them before they become a client. And for me, that is a two-way thing. It's not just them checking me out, I'm checking them out. Do I think I can work with them? And I think when I was starting out, there were probably times when I've maybe taken on a client when I'm thinking afterwards, maybe they're not my ideal client. You know, and you learn through experience with these things, don't you? And interestingly, I was having a chat with another coach just last week, and she had a lovely term for it. She called it a chemistry session, and I thought, oh, I like that. That's really good. So just checking out the chemistry. Do you think you can with this person? And I think
yeah. Sorry, I've done it again. I'm getting my timing wrong here. Sorry, I cut you off. Do continue, please.
Yeah, I was just saying, I think, you know, depending on the context. So for me, it's important that I feel I have a lot of rapport with somebody when I'm coaching them. And I feel that I need probably some similarities, not necessarily all the time, but if I'm wanting to, but I am very aware that if I want to grow and develop, having conversations with people who are not like-minded is a really good way to do that, but I wouldn't necessarily want to coach them. Like, so I think there is a difference.
Yeah, that's a very human response. And after all, we're not robots, but we don't park our humanity in a corner and become some sort of unfeeling, less warm-blooded beast. I think you're absolutely right. And the issue for me is, I think the use of chemistry session is interesting. I think sometimes the chemistry session is all very well, but it's as you begin to work with someone that the clashes, the lack of empathy, perhaps, the difficulties emerge that can't be identified really early on.
Yeah. And I think that's where, again, the contracting and the ethics is so important to have addressed beforehand, you know, because then you can draw back. So if you feel that some things are perhaps being pushed or boundaries sort of being stretched or whatever, then I think that's where we can point people back to these ethics or contracting at the beginning of the relationship. And I think, you know, certainly when I was starting out, I have been caught out with that. And I've realised maybe first proper session or second session in, I'm thinking, maybe I didn't have a clear conversation with them about this as I think I had, you know. And so, again, it's one of these things that you learn as you're going along sometimes.
Well, some of the best contracting and ethical codes I've seen emphasize that either party can end the relationship at any time. One would hope with an explanation and a context, but I think ethically it's important that both parties feel they're not tied into something. That's harder to do when you're working in the corporate context, where the client, the fee-paying client, might not be too pleased to have you say, oh, I can't work with them.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's where it becomes more awkward, isn't it? And where the ethics are really important, but it can sometimes get a little bit murky, because ultimately, who are you responsible to?
I have that conversation a lot with myself. Who's the client here? Then let's get into some real specifics. Let's talk about the sort of real issues that are around. Certainly, I know I've grappled with in an ethical consideration. One of them certainly is confidentiality. Confidentiality appears in any code of ethics. I looked over the ACC and ICF and no doubt other three-letter abbreviations before having this conversation, just to see the headings again. And good old confidentiality is always there. Confidentiality is hard to be absolutely tied down about, isn't it? It's easy to say, oh yes, nothing should ever come out of that relationship. Sometimes in a corporate context, the fee-paying client wants some sort of feel for what's going on, as a coach, you're in the ethical situation of saying how much is too much, how much is enough, is anything at all appropriate? Did I clarify with all parties just what the rules were in advance? Those confidentiality is a good test of ethical practice.
Yeah, it is. I think it's a really good point, and I suppose that's where you need to be really upfront with both parties. This is what I'm willing to share. Are you, and as a client, as in the coachee, are you happy that I'm going to share this back to the paying client? So being very clear right up front, and whether you can get away with just giving sort of topics of discussion rather than anything very specific in there necessarily, or can you, is there some sort of baseline measure that you can take? So there are a number of ways that we can feed back, but I think we have to be very clear about what they are and how we do it and when we do it and who knows about it.
Absolutely, and it's difficult to talk about because it's so contextually specific, because I'm thinking of very specific instances when I've been in that very position. I must admit, and I'm prepared to say this on tape to anyone who hears this, I come down on the side of the person I'm sat in front of. There are many times in which I both feel and I say to the person I'm coaching, this is between us. We all know that Rebecca, Andrew, Fred, whatever it is, would like to hear about this. They're not going to from me. And I think that is a judgment, and it's not always possible to get it right, but you've got to stand by what you tell them you're going to do.
Yes, very much so. And I think ultimately it does serve everybody better if you can do that, because ultimately the employer who may be paying for the session will end up with the best situation, because if the person doesn't want to stay in the organisation, then that's a better thing to have them leave than it is to stay and be a resentful, productive member of staff. So sometimes you I know it must be very difficult for them if they're paying the bill, but they have to trust in the process that ultimately the right result will occur, whether that's the person staying and being happier, more productive, whatever it is that they're hoping the outcome will be, or whether that's leaving and not being not necessarily a problem, but not being an employee who's not happy there. So
engaged
one, but I think ultimately the results are right.
Oh yeah, and I guess there's also another ethical issue interwoven with that. If one was unethical, if one behaved improperly, you could actually string out a contract longer than it should by the information or lack of it that you feed to the fee-paying client. Well, we're making progress, but it's going to take another 6 months. Because I think another element of unethical behaviour is when you're basically behaving in your own interest, be they financial or otherwise.
Yes, yeah, definitely. I think that's a really good point, actually. And certainly, if it's individuals, so like I say, I generally work more with individuals, so I don't think I could get away with that as easily. With an individual, they would let me know whether it's working for them or not, and but I guess for an employer, then yeah, you're right. You certainly could probably just sort of extend it a little bit longer and say, oh well, actually, another couple of sessions and it'll be much better.
Or less, because if you want to get out, but there's a reason to stay, you could say, right, here's my ticket out of this place. Yeah, everything's worked out fine. We've achieved what we're going to. When really you're saying to yourself, hang on a minute, if I'm going to fulfill what I'm here to do, I should be here another 6 months.
Yeah, definitely.
It's tricky, isn't it? And I think a lot of it, you're right, is down to how well you contract and how thoroughly you go into potential issues initially with whoever the client is, if it's not the direct person you're working with.
Yeah, and I think as new coaches, that can be something very difficult to manage at first. I think we often learn unfortunately, through getting burned. Whether that's a minor burn or a major burn. Luckily, touch wood, I've only had experiences where I've thought, maybe I'll be a little bit more selective about the type of people I work with in future, or maybe I need to make sure I'm explicit with the guideline and the terms and conditions goes out way before I do anything else, and people need to really fully understand them, that sort of thing, so, but it does certainly make you think, doesn't it?
It does, and I think you're right. It is about clarity. I'm thinking now about broad headings. I think another one for me, I think information passage or not is the big one for me. What deciding what to do with what you know. But I think there are other things. I think thinking about ethics. I mean, I look at, I read, and like yourself, I pass on to those I work with ethical codes. I tend to follow the ICF code, and to me. And I have done a bit of reading around this as well. Ethics is about the explicit statement of a code of conduct, a collective, if you like, explicit document. The thing then is, for me, an individual coach will interpret that in their own way. You could read the same code of ethics and go about what you do in one way, and that could be markedly different to my own. So our own interpretation of that's ethics. I think the other thing is values. That isn't a value statement. You can't impose values collectively on people. Our own personal values is what drives our interpretation and our either adherence or not of those ethics. I think it's not as clear cut as we think. Values and ethics are in there, and they often don't mix completely.
Yeah, that's a really good point about the values in there and our own interpretations of things. I suppose to some extent there is a general level of understanding when we're looking at these things, but like you say, we interpret them in very different ways. So yeah, that's potentially where things can get tricky, isn't it?
I personally, correct, I'm making myself sound like some sort of inept coach here. But I personally feel I have a problem with overhelping. I have an inclination to be more helpful than I feel is very often felt to be proper for me. And because I know about it, I do it less often than perhaps I used to. But many times I'm thinking to myself, hang on a minute, I know what I think is the answer to this, but it's not helpful, it's not the right thing to do. And for me, ethics is about doing things right. And it's not right to provide more answers for people, or the answers you feel you've got, when you haven't given them a chance to explore and find their own.
Yeah, and it is such a tricky one. I think as coaches, we are helpful people. We want to help people. That's why we go into it. So the temptation to just make a few suggestions here and there, and
yes,
but I'm just thinking, but if they did this, or if they tried that, then or if they just did this, then it'd work. You can't do that, and as coaches, it is really difficult sometimes to refrain from doing that. But like you said, by doing that, we're actually doing our clients a disservice.
Yes.
Because we're not giving them that learning opportunity.
As I sit here, I'm still uncomfortable with even the thought of it, because I don't like leaving someone having not helped them. And I think you're right. What we call help is not help at all very often. It's just what we call help. But sometimes I do think I could have somehow subtly questioning or whatever, because it's not just about maneuvering somebody towards a position that you would have otherwise got them to. It's about them finding genuinely their own path, and that's a hard thing I find to do sometimes. I really do.
Yeah, it is, and that's the thing with coaching, isn't it? It's if it's done well, it's such an empowering process. And the idea is, we're not giving people answers, but we're giving them the tools to find their own answers. and deal with things in the future. If we're giving them solutions very easily, then it's not going to help them, 3-6 months down the line when they've got a similar situation, because they haven't got the skills to deal with it themselves, where it might be a slightly slower process to do it. And not give them the answers or the help as perhaps we would like to, but actually we're giving them the long-term skills to enable them to deal with it better themselves in future.
It all sounds great. And I'll try and remember those words next time I'm in that quandary, because it's regular with me. It really is. I've just scribbled another 3 or 4 words here. Parameters of competence. I think it's unethical for a coach to knowingly do what they shouldn't do, maybe move into an arena or an area of activity that is beyond their known competence.
I would hope everybody felt uncomfortable in doing that. I know some people don't necessarily, but yeah, I think for me, it's not just ethics, it's a moral thing as well. I certainly I would struggle, I think, and I think sometimes as a beginner, I certainly went the other way almost. I was.
You stayed within
I actually had that experience. Yeah. I knew what I was doing, but I was like, oh well, I'm not sure. Can I do this? Have I got the skills and the competence to do this? And so you've got to get that balance right. You have to be confident in your own skills and your own competence, but you also have to be very mindful of where your boundaries are with that as well, don't you? And your limits to some extent.
I know where that means for me. I know I'm not a therapist. I know I'm not a psychologist. I know I'm not a load of things. It makes me wonder if I know what I really am. And I think you're right. The danger is probably for those people who think about this consciously to stay sometimes too far within their parameters, maybe not to stretch themselves to the point where they can be of most help. But it's better you stay within, even if it's a long way within, than you stray beyond.
Yeah, because there's the potential. It's that Pandora's box thing, isn't it? If you go into down an avenue that you haven't actually got the skills or the experience or the competence to deal with and open up a can of worms, then you're in big trouble, really. So as a coach, I'm very conscious that I want to help the person feel better, have more skills to deal with things, and be a better human being after they've had work with me, rather than the opposite and leave them a quivering wreck.
And of course, we're to judge our own parameters of competence, and I'm using those terms again, is not a precise thing either. Just because we think it's somewhere, it could be inside or outside of that. So it's not a explicit and clear thing, is it? And it could vary from one individual and their context to another. I've certainly found myself in conversations very close to where I think I'm able to be helpful, and had to say to the person, we're getting ever so close to where I can't help you any further on this matter if it means this, if you like.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a good way of addressing it, isn't it? And giving your client that warning then allows them to make the decision to stop where they are, or risk sort of going further, but you saying no, that's it, I can't do any more with you. So I think, but again, as coaches, we have to learn to recognize those points where we're heading into territory that is perhaps not our own.
And we do it in the moment, and that's not easy to do, because very often, of course, these sorts of careful judgments and these sorts of scenarios are sometimes emotional, they're sometimes unexpected, they're sometimes highly intense and requiring real focus from us. And that's the hardest time of all, sometimes, to have the headspace left to say, and hold on a minute, am I even competent to do this?
Yeah, it is right. And it can be very draining at times, because yes, we're using lots of different skills. So listening on a very different level,
yes,
processing information, being able to reflect, and actually reading the body language of the client as well. There's so many things to take in. It is, you do have to be in the right headspace before you enter a session with a client, I think. To be
amazing people to have all these skills. I'm going to throw another one in. I think, and you might expect me to take this view, I think it's unethical not to consciously and deliberately and tangibly show that you're developing your skills, knowledge, and abilities. In other words, I think to not engage meaningfully in CPD is unethical.
Ooh, that's a good one. Yes. Yeah. I would agree with you, but I do wonder whether everybody would feel the same in that, well, I did my qualification, I've got my piece of paper that tells me I can do this sort of thing,
Yeah.
But yes, I would agree. I think you have to be developing all the time. And I think it's only fair that we do that because we expect our clients to do that as well. So things change, adapt, there's new ways of doing things, there's new ideas, and just being able to stretch and be enthusiastic ourselves. I think the risk is if we don't continue to develop, we can get stale in what we're doing.
Well, I think so. And as I say, for someone who's on the extreme end of CPD as myself, this isn't appropriate for me to go into that. You might expect me to take that view because I'm rock solid. But I think what I'm getting to with that is, I think it's unethical, it's wrong, it's improper to not be up to date, to not be sufficiently aware of the growing body of knowledge that helps us be effective and to grow in effectiveness as coaches.
Yeah, and I would agree, because I think, in any profession, really, you need to be keeping your skills up to date and fresh so that you're the best coach you can be. And also, one of the things that I've seen on a few of the sort of ethics and things that I've read is actually maintaining the standards of the industry as well. So the last thing you need is some rogue coaches who haven't, kept up with their training, or they've perhaps done one of these online weekend courses and believe that they're qualified to do everything. So it's really important that we maintain standards to protect the industry as a whole, not just ourselves.
No, I think that's very true. We've got our own rogue traders, just as plumbers and everybody else has. I wanted to touch on the issue of supervision. Some people I know in the coaching business treat supervision as some sort of frilly extra or an expensive option they can't afford. Others just reject it out of hand. I know firsthand the value of supervision, even if that's co-supervision. I supervise you, you supervise me, as long as that's meaningful and robust. I also believe that it's right that coaches have a degree of supervision, have an opportunity to unpack their practice, to explore issues with someone in a supervisory role.
Yeah, and I think when I first started out, because I'm not a particular member of any bodies as such, when I'm working with individuals, I haven't found that individuals require that, and it really wouldn't make any difference to them. I know working for more of a corporate background or organisation, then they would probably expect me to have that. And obviously some of the criteria for that is to get supervision. So I sort of lumped it in with being a member of whatever. I don't need to do supervision. But then I experienced a supervision probably maybe 2 years ago now, and I have to say I was pretty blown away by it, because supervisors have this extra level of skill. They just whip out this question and it's just absolutely fantastic. Like, wow, where did that just come from? That's brilliant. And so yes, I really do see the value in supervision now. So I mainly had group supervision, again, which was a really interesting experience and process to share with other coaches. So that was formal supervision, and we tested out different tools and brought different issues to the group. So that was really helpful. And I have done sort of, I suppose you can call it co-supervision with fellow coaches, talking about different things and what have you. So I do believe it is a really important part of our development. Yeah, definitely, I'd agree with you.
And of course, within supervision of any sort, there's also ethical matters. To what degree do you divulge? To what degree do you have trust in your supervisor? Have you and your supervisor yourselves discussed the parameters, the confidentiality issues, and so on? Because the more transparent and candid and open that process, in a trusting context, the more useful it will be to you. So there's ethical considerations there too, aren't there?
Yeah, again, really, with this group supervision process, the first session that we had as a group, we were all aware of, we all I think we all knew each other, so we're all from the same coaching forum.
Mm-hmm.
And it was only a small group, but we spent the first session contracting almost, really.
Good.
What are the group guidelines? What are we happy with? Do we want to sort of cover that contracting at the beginning of every group supervision session? Or are we going to go forward with these, and we'll keep these in place? And I was very surprised at how much time we spent doing that, but it was very worth it, and I could see the value in it afterwards, in actually looking at all these different points, and that was a very useful experience in itself.
It's interesting. I mean, and again, time as ever is on us, so I'm hesitating to raise huge issues again that will take many minutes. But you mentioned contracting. Then we've talked about contracting during this conversation, and I think we both feel very strongly. I know we both feel very strongly that contracting is an ethical situation. We must have clarity about the expectations. We must also be clear about what we're working on incidentally and transactionally with clients. We don't say, right, here we are, what should we talk about today? It's ethical to have a clear and shared perspective of what each conversation, each interaction is going to be about. I suppose the other thing that there's something quite sportive to it about note taking. This is something I got a bee in my bonnet about some time ago, about the ethical considerations about keeping records and notes. What do you do on that? Do you have any ethical thoughts around what notes you keep and how secure they are?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I don't take lots of notes. I take some, but not lots, and that's more to jog my memory, basically, rather than anything else, just to sort of key points. So I've had this conversation about note taking with many coaches, and I don't think there's a right and wrong. I think it's what
that's right.
feel. But again, I don't like writing lots of notes when I'm with the client, because
nor do I.
So I will often, I do warn them. I say I may take a few notes, but I will try and keep it to just a few notes while I'm with the client. But then I don't feel that I want to spend ages afterwards writing anything up.
Oh, sure.
You know, I write what I write, and I might just read through them to make sure I've captured the key points that I wanted to keep. But that's it. I certainly don't keep copious amounts of records for my clients at all. And I do expressly say to them that I would expect them to take notes themselves. I'm certainly not going to write notes to send out to them. It's down to them if they want to take their own notes, and I do encourage that. So sometimes that will happen as well. But yes, the note taking is a very interesting one.
Well, I think it is interesting because it's wrapped up with some other issues you talked about. Because if you don't keep your notes secure, then you've got a confidentiality breach. There are people who may be very interested in the outcome of the conversations you have with people. So I think it sounds very specific. It sounds very perhaps insignificant, but it's not to me, because if you don't keep your note taking secure, if you don't manage it in a proper manner, that could involve a breakdown in all sorts of ways of the relationship.
Yeah, and as part of my insurance requirements, I believe I have to keep my notes for 5 years. So any notes I do take, but they can be destroyed after that, so they'll just get shredded after that 5-year process. I certainly don't like hanging on to them longer than necessary. So yeah, it is really important.
Well, I think the thing with ethics is some things are headline, aren't they? Confidentiality, I don't know, agendas, that sort of stuff. They stand out. And other things, when you dig into it, are quite specific. And very often they're specific to even the nature of the relationship with one person or in any one organization. So this is a very imprecise area, but very, very important, because doing things right, and less often wrong at the very least, is something we should strive to do. You're never going to get it perfect and right, but at least if doing things right is consciously on our agenda, it's more likely to work that way more often than if it wasn't.
Yeah. And I think, there is I would like us to educate sort of clients more fully in this as well, in for them to take some responsibility, and just if they come across a coach who just goes straight into sessions with no contracting and no talk of ethics or any guidelines or anything like that, then I think they need to be questioning the competence of that coach, you know, because unfortunately there are instances where people, like I said, will just do a weekend course and think they're a coach, and then that's it. But
coaching boot camp.
yeah, and it's not like it takes a long time to, you know, to practice. I put a lot of time and effort into training and practicing and developing my business. So it's really important to me that as an industry, we look at things as well and make sure that we're helping people at the end of the day.
Yeah, we don't want to get too pious, but it is about maintaining standards. So, okay, I think, you know, much as we both know we could go on, we've reached 40 minutes, which I reckon is just about as much as we can inflict on people at a time. And I hope people have enjoyed having this inflicted upon them. It's certainly raised issues for me that I didn't think it would, and that can be valuable to reflect upon. So once again, thank you very much for that, Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Andrew.